On the broadcast tonight, we break down the realities of Ebola, what's true about the disease, what's not, and how it compares to other common infections. And some members of the international coalition formed to fight ISIS are dealing with a lot more than just the terrorist group. Decide conflicts affect overall mission against the Islamic State. And finally, midterms are fast approaching. We'll have all the races to watch and which issues are affecting voters. Talking Point starts right now. Hello and welcome to another edition of Talking Points. I'm Nick Cardona. President Obama says he is cautiously optimistic about containing Ebola here in the U.S. after the Center for Disease Control introduced more comprehensive safety standards for doctors while airports have improved Ebola screening. But some experts say it's important not to go overboard. I sat down with our special medical correspondent, Sawyer Rosenstein, who explains how Ebola compares to other common infections Americans and people all over the world battle every year. Joining me now is our special science correspondent, Sawyer Rosenstein. Good to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so I first want to start off with the craze over this disease going on, Ebola, right now. Obviously, we're talking about that. Now, does this disease relate to any disease in the past that you've seen?
Well, it kind of does, yeah. It's not an exact correlation because obviously all diseases are slightly different, but I think the biggest thing to look at when comparing this with any disease is basically the infectiousness of it and how it spreads. Because you've heard a lot about how Ebola, it spread mainly through direct contact with bodily fluids of someone who has it. Mm-hmm. And that actually has a lot to do with its infectiousness because it's relatively low in terms of how many people can get it because of that. Mm-hmm. There's actually a great scale called R0 mm-hmm. or R0, which is kind of what scientists use to basically compare.
How does that system work? How do they come to the conclusion about how severe this disease is? How do they come to that conclusion?
Well, they pretty much put it on a scale of 0, and it can go pretty much anywhere up to a large number. So, like the largest one, for example, is measles, which has 18. Mm-hmm. And basically, that's how many people will be infected after that first person is infected. So, Ebola is about 1.5, or for rounding sake, we'll say about 2. Mm-hmm. So, for every person that has Ebola, they'll infect 2 people. Because again, 2 sounds relatively low compared to measles, which has 18. Mm-hmm. But think about it, that spreads to 2 people, which then spreads to 4 and 8, and it multiplies and so on.
Now, with other diseases, like you mentioned, like measles being at such a higher level on that scale, why in this country are we focusing so much on Ebola and people getting infected when we should be focusing on other diseases that are killing more and more people each year, like the flu, like measles? Like what is the basis of that argument?
I don't know. I think because it's that fear of just how fast it is once it hits, mm-hmm. Once you get it, how many people die from it, especially in Africa. Mm-hmm. But the big thing in the U.S. is that we have a great medical system here, unlike a lot of those third world countries, and that we can actually treat it and take care of it, versus other things which are similar to Ebola on that R0 scale, such as HIV, mm-hmm. which is a 4. It's pretty close, mm-hmm. but it has to do with how fast it spreads and how well we can treat it here in the U.S.
How infectious is this disease? Is it something that we need to be concerned about, or is it something that we need to focus our attention on West African nations that are really dealing with the hardships of it?
I think it really needs to focus on West Africa, because if you look at U.S. numbers of other diseases, of pretty famous ones, so for Ebola, we know that we have 3 people that were infected, 1 person who's died. If you remember a few months ago, the big thing was enterovirus D68. That one, about 1,000 people have gotten it, mainly kids, and at least 5 people have died from that. When you look at the flu, which you get all the time, that one, about 200,000 people in the U.S. alone are hospitalized. About 5 to 20% of the whole population ends up getting the flu, mm-hmm. and about 25,000 people die on average every year in the U.S. from the flu and flu-related complications. So in comparison, 1 death versus about 25,000. I think we have to focus more on getting a flu shot than worrying about getting Ebola.
And I think that also stems from the coverage as well. So Sawyer, thank you so much for that update. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great discussion with Sawyer there. Joining me now is our senior correspondent, Will Gerhardt, to break it all down. Will, thank you for being here.
Nick, thanks for having me.
All right, so I want to move to Crouse Hospital and localize this issue a little bit for us. What's the protocol going on now at Crouse?
So something Krauss is doing that's very interesting is they're having these rooms where they would put a prospective Ebola patient called negative pressure rooms. Mm-hmm. Now these rooms allow air, or when the doors open, air can come out, but it cannot come in. So essentially that means, I'm sorry, it's the other way. Air cannot go out, meaning if there was an Ebola patient in there, any air that could possibly be contaminated, although we know that Ebola is not, cannot be an airborne virus. But any air that was in there with a possible Ebola patient would not escape, so any of the disease would be stuck in the room. Some specific preparations that Krauss is making is they're using a lot of volunteers to do this work, and they're kind of mixing it up, throwing a lot of different volunteers in so that they can keep circulating people so that the same people are not focused on the same issues. They're also distributing personal protective gear for volunteer doctors and nurses. Along with that, they're having mandatory mock drills in case a case were to come to Syracuse. And the final thing is that they're issuing new safety guidelines that exceed the expectations of the CDC. Of course, that's just extra protocol to ensure that they'll be safe at Krauss.
Okay, so I want to move now to a controversy that's going on in our neighborhood in Syracuse University. Dean Branham has recently rescinded an invitation to a photojournalist who has been in the area of Ebola and who's actually passed the 21-day incubation period. But what's the latest with that? What are some of the reactions going forward with that?
Well, a lot of on the national level, a lot of the reactions have been is this a huge over-exaggeration? Are people really too crazy about this? Is it really that big of a deal? And a lot of these emotions are being felt in Syracuse as well. The thing about the case of Michael Ducille, as you said, he followed all the protocol. He followed all of the guidelines that the CDC presents in terms of coming back safe. And Dean Branham in Newhouse essentially rescinded his invitation as an extra way of making sure that the disease could not spread to Syracuse.
Because it's more of a precautionary to not only, you want to maintain integrity of your school, but you also want to, ensure the safety of your students. Was that also among her concerns?
I think safety of the students was the number one concern. Newhouse, of course, has plenty of very high-profile and esteemed guests who come throughout the year, and Michael Ducille was another one of them. And with him being in Liberia, he had so many unique experiences that he could have offered if he were to speak and be at that panel. But the big issue here is the case of the health and safety of the students, because worst case scenario, say he did contract it and he did pass on here in Syracuse, that would open up a whole new can of worms for Newhouse and Dean Branham to deal with. So they tried to address it before it even happened. Obviously, again, a mixed reaction on how that went.
All right, well, we'll be following it. Will, thank you so much.
Thanks,
appreciate it. All right, coming up, many members of the international coalition that's been formed to fight the Islamic State militants are dealing with domestic problems of their own. How this affects the bottom line. Stay tuned.
Viking, red state, blue state, vegan,
carnivore. We come from different places.
uptown, downtown,
night owl,
Early bird. We come to different conclusions.
half empty.
half full.
But when we live united, we create real, lasting change in the building blocks of life. The education, income, and health of our communities,
Live
our families,
united.
even the person next to us.
Live united.
Real change won't happen without you. So give, advocate, volunteer, live united. Sign up at liveunited.org.
Welcome back. We now move to the latest military developments in the international battle against ISIS. U.S. airstrikes in Syria continue, and the fight to keep Kobani rages on. Joining me now, Talking Points international correspondent Claire Moran, who has been following the developments on this issue closely. Claire, what are you seeing as the latest? What have you been reporting on?
Well, thank you for having me, Nick. There was 4 big news stories this week regarding ISIS. One on the domestic front. We talked about a couple weeks ago how there's been a lot of Western recruitment going on with ISIS, and there were 3 teenage girls who were, the U.S. government met them in Frankfurt, Germany, and brought them home because they were on their way to Turkey, and it's thought that they were going to join ISIS. So that was a big story this week because it came to the domestic side. Also, ISIS is advancing on Mount Sinjar, which you might remember is the place where all the Yazidis are, and they are requesting more help from the United States. That's the group that the United States gave air help to a couple months ago, and that was a big development in our ISIS strategy. So that's a big deal that they're going back there after we had removed them from there. Also, there was a big story because the United States began airdrops of supplies, and ISIS got their hands on a couple of those packages, and those included weapons. And it was a small number, but it was a big story that could happen. And finally, Turkey is allowing Kurdish fighters to cross into Kobani through their borders, which is a big step for Turkey because Turkey has not been involved before, and they've been going back and forth a lot.
All right, Claire Moran with the latest. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, I sat down with our very own Josh Carney to talk more about the global coalition and the latest in the Middle East. Here is that interview. Correspondent Josh Carney. Josh, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me on the show, Nick.
All right, so first of all, we want to talk about the coalition that has been created by the president. Why do we need this coalition? What's important about it?
Well, the United States needs to strategically align itself within the region, and it needs to do that with regional powerhouses. Now, the idea behind this is to make sure that the United States can play a role in this affair without actually committing itself militarily. It wants to rely more on the region than rely on its own ability to intervene. And John Kerry summed this up on August 29th in his op-ed in the New York Times pretty well. He said that airstrikes alone won't defeat this enemy. A much fuller response is demanded from the world. We need to support Iraqi forces and the moderate Syrian opposition who are facing ISIS on the front lines. We need to disrupt and degrade ISIS capabilities and counter its extremist message in the media. And we need to strengthen our own defenses and cooperate in protecting our people. So by factoring in all those different variables that Kerry outlines, it's imperative that the United States take an active role in trying to find partners in this region in order to successfully deter this threat.
Who are the key players in that coalition?
The key players in that coalition are going to be those who are aligned with NATO and those who are trying to commit themselves humanitarily through aid as well as militarily through supporting us in airstrikes. The key players as of right now who are supporting airstrikes other than the United States specifically is the nation of France, and the Netherlands have also stepped up. Now, they're aligned with the United States strategically because they want to erode the threat of ISIS, but we're also going to have to depend on key players within the region, most likely Saudi Arabia and Turkey. So we have to kind of face the fact that the key players are going to be those that we haven't relied on before, and thus that poses a slight threat for the United States because it is something that we do not necessarily know what we're getting ourselves into.
Who can the U.S. depend on mostly in that region?
Now, the United States can mostly depend on Saudi Arabia at this point, considering we've given them a tense amount of military benefits. We haven't had to depend on them in the past, but we're going to have to ask a lot of them. One, that they train indigenous forces that are already there, like modern Syrian rebels, the Iraqi troops, and other relevant bodies within this region. We're going to depend on them for a lot, not only their military support, but their fiscal support. And we're going to have to depend on them in the future, being that they're going to be the stable horse within this race. Now, Turkey, unfortunately, we're also going to have to play a major role in aligning with the United States in this affair. So one critical juncture that's facing the United States there is the northern Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan have been marginalized by the Turkish government, and thus it poses a dramatic threat to the United States' overall mission.
In our final 30 seconds, I want to talk about the coalition. Is it an effective strategy, or is it just a pipe dream? What's going on?
United States State Department officials, as well as the Department of Defense, claim that it's going to be a game of hurry up and wait. It's going to take a lot of strategic patience, and thus the United States cannot worry itself with moving too fast. However, that is not enough for the United States, especially the American people who are war-weary and don't want to become involved with another true fight. So it's not necessarily a pipe dream, but there are an immense amount of logical fallacies with who we're going to have to depend on and what they're going to have to do for us.
All right, well, Josh Carney, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, well, joining me now is Zach Zelif. He is the president of the LIME, Israeli-Palestinian Dialogue Group on campus. Zach, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
All right, so first of all, I want to get your reaction to the coalition that's being built by our country here. I mean, is it an effective strategy on our part? Is it going to work in the future? What's going on with that?
I think for now, it's about all the administration can do to try and gain support in the fight against ISIS. In the long run, I really think it's going to take some winning the hearts and minds of the people on the ground, specifically Sunni Islams in western Iraq who feel disenfranchised by the government of Iraq, which for a long time was run by the Shia Islam Nouri al-Maliki. He has since been replaced by another Shia Muslim, Haider al-Abadi, but the hope is that those Sunnis in Western Iraq will feel more part of the new government, and they will start to push back against ISIS themselves, similar to what happened in the Awakening in 2008 to take back the Anbar province. In Syria, it's somewhat of a more uphill battle. It's very difficult right now to find rebel groups that are willing to work with the United States. A lot of the rebel groups that we were hoping to get have come out and said, we're not working with the United States. It's really unpopular. There's a really strong anti-US feeling in the region, and it's hard to overcome that. So for now, building that international support is about all we can do, trying to stem back ISIS with airstrikes, but in the long term, I think it's really going to take some movement on the ground and getting the people of those regions to fight back against ISIS themselves, which I think will eventually happen because of the brutality of the ISIS regime.
Going off of what Josh said in that interview before us, he talked about countries that the U.S. can depend on. Who do you think what do you think the country that the U.S. can most depend on in this coalition?
I agree with him. I think it's Saudi Arabia. I don't think most depend on is that there's really anyone that you can say they're a steadfast ally. Everyone's really on their own. They're working for their own interests. I think Saudi Arabia has traditionally been one of our biggest allies and is afraid of the effects of ISIS spreading into their own kingdom and overthrowing their regime.
What about Turkey? What about Turkey in this
Turkey, I
equation?
think, is probably the least dependent ally we have, but also the most important. So Turkey regionally is right next to Syria. The Battle of Kobani is right on their doorstep. A lot of support from Turkey has unintentionally gone to ISIS earlier in the Syrian revolution, and they've been responsible for a lot of the open border where ISIS fighters got in to Syria from Turkey. Prime Minister Erdogan has been very hesitant to work with the United States. He has traditionally been trying to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Syria at all costs, which has really helped ISIS building up their platform in Syria because they've benefited by those open borders and by kind of the loose military aid and Turkey not really checking where it was going. So obviously fixing those things is going to be vital, but Prime Minister Erdogan has shown real hesitance to work with the United States, especially because of the Kurdish question.
Okay, so in our final minute here, I want to talk about this actually debate that happened on Bill Maher's show with Ben Affleck. He got into a heated debate about Islamophobia in this country. Do you think that's is that a debate that we need to have in this country? Is that are we becoming more and more Islamophobic in this country? What do you think?
I think it's kind of a running strand of American Islamophobia stemming since 9/11. I think you've seen it pop up and come down at different times, and I think ISIS has kind of added to it in a different way. I think it's a valid debate to have. I think it is rising for the time being, and I think it's a bad thing. But obviously, there's a debate out there. Self-proclaimed liberal Bill Maher railing against Islam. So,
all right.
We'll see.
Well, Zach, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate
Thanks,
it. All right, up next, a surprise poll in Colorado could shake things up and the state of the race for the Senate, as well as a look at the top issues facing voters this year. Stay tuned.
There is no credit fairy.
How else will I get a better credit score?
Look, you keep your credit card balances low and only open a new card if you really need it.
No fairy?
There's no magic to improving your credit, but there's help, and it's free. Go to creditfairy.org.
Know what?
What?
Since I got adopted, I've learned a lot about these humans.
I know. I mean, check out these two. It's Flirt City over here.
Yeah, I noticed that. It looks like my human is definitely into your human.
Oh, look! I think she's getting his number.
Nice.
Your human's got some sweet moves.
Takes after his dog. Oh, look, they're doing that thing where they put their arms around each other.
She kicked up a leg. It's like in the movies.
That's awesome. Looks like we're going to be hanging out a little bit more.
We're good. Welcome back. Candidates all over the nation look to gain or keep congressional seats are down to the wire. The election is just a couple of weeks away. Joining me now for an update on the elections you should know about is Talking Points political correspondent Alex Amico. Alex, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so what are the, we're talking about Colorado here is the main one that you're focusing on. What's going on there?
Right, so it's been a bit of a surprising shift in the past month. All 8 of the public polls this month, Republican Cory Gardner leads the Democratic incumbent Mark Udall. The most recent poll, he's up by 7. That's a USA Today poll. Some of the possible reasons for that, Udall has been mostly running his campaign on one issue. He's been attacking Gardner for his stances on women's issues. He's been attacking him for his support for the Hobby Lobby decision and for the fact that he once voted for a personhood amendment that defined that life began at conception. Some of the other reasons is President Obama has a 41% approval rating in Colorado, so of course Udall being tied to his administration doesn't help him. Additionally, there was recently a story about residents of Denver trying to join the Islamic State. And so on those issues of national security, a lot of times you'll see people turn to Republicans over Democrats. So that could be a reason that the polls are breaking for Gardner right now.
All right. Well, what's the state of the Senate? We're looking at a race that could it could determine who's going to be the majority party in the Senate come November. So what's going on there? What are the key races besides Colorado that we're looking at?
So right now, we said from the beginning that Republicans are going to pick up the former Democratic seats of Montana and West Virginia. They're probably still going to get South Dakota. It's not going to be by as big of a margin as they were, probably, but they're probably still going to win it. Arkansas is still trending towards the Republicans, as is Alaska. So if they win those 5 seats, they need to defend all of their seats and win 1 more in order to control the Senate. So where could that last seat come from? It's probably not going to come from North Carolina. Kay Hagan's been running a very good campaign, and she's been leading Tom Tillis in most of the recent polls. It could come from Iowa. Iowa's one of the tighter races. The most recent poll has it within 1. That's Joni Ernst versus Bruce Braley. Braley has not run a great campaign. He's had a lot of gaffes. There was a big thing with he and his wife tried to sue their neighbor over chickens walking into their yard, and one of the most publicized gaffes was he called Iowa's other senator a, quote, farmer from Iowa who never went to law school. So he's having some trouble connecting with the Iowa electorate. Louisiana is another possibility. That one right now looks like it could be headed for a runoff. So if Republicans win 5 seats on election night and don't lose any seats, it is possible that Louisiana could be the deciding factor in that December runoff.
What about Kentucky and Georgia? We talk about Michelle Nunn, and we talk about Allison Lonergan-Grimes, and we talk about Mitch McConnell. What's going on with there? Is Allison Lonergan-Grimes kind of closing the gap here on this?
Right. So we said last week that the DSCC took their money out of Kentucky and started spending more in Georgia. They actually started buying TV time back in Kentucky because they recently saw a new poll that showed the race was a statistical tie. Yeah. That race is, there's a lot of different ways people are interpreting that race, but right now it's definitely going to make for an interesting election night. As far as Georgia goes, that also looks like it could be headed for a runoff. So, and that runoff wouldn't be till January. So that's definitely an interesting race to look at. So I think that those races, Georgia, Kentucky, South Dakota to a lesser extent, and definitely Kansas, are going to make for a very interesting election night as far as who controls the Senate.
And you also mentioned to me that we might not even know who controls the Senate until late December. Is
right,
that what you
right. If Republicans win those 5 seats that we mentioned, they don't lose any seats, but then they lose all the other Democratic-controlled seats, and it comes down to Louisiana, that will be the deciding factor. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens as far as how Republicans perform on election night and whether or not they end up unseating Democrats in the Senate.
Alex Amico, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Now a look at some of the issues that are influencing these elections. We have Talking Points correspondent Mike Riccardi here with us. Mike, thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
All right, so I want to talk about the main issues that voters are looking at this fall. What have you been finding?
Well, the top issue is the economy, which it always has been. But the one thing to note is that in May, about 60% of voters labeled the economy as the top issue, and due to things like ISIS and Ebola, now in our latest poll in October, it's dropped to about 40%. And so, Republicans run on things, attacking Democrats on things like spending and taxes, and Democrats are going to come back at them, highlighting their job creation and attacking their links with big business. And the one thing to note is that in the latest ABC and Washington Post poll, about 70% of Americans feel that the economy is on the wrong track, and 42% of them feel they approve of Obama's job performance, which is an all-time low for him. So it's not looking very good.
So, I mean, we've been talking a lot on the show about ISIS and Ebola, and those are kind of the new issues facing us as voters. How are they playing into this race? Are they relying on the mommy problem and the daddy problem in both Republican and Democrats in their camps?
Definitely ISIS. Ebola is another story, but as far as ISIS goes, in the latest political poll, 84% of people feel that ISIS poses a serious threat to America, which definitely plays into the hands of Republicans as they're seen as the more hawkish party. They're definitely stronger on foreign relations. And, after Obama made the gaffe of calling them the JV team, they've been definitely calling him out and, labeling him as inefficient to deal with this problem. Now, Ebola, on the other hand, is very unique. About 42% of Republicans have some confidence in the government with their ability to handle it, whereas 81% of Democrats have some confidence with the government's ability. And, CNN is linking this with the fact that basically it's just because, Ebola is a serious issue, where at 5:38 they actually called out CNN and Politico and basically said it's not because of Ebola, but it's just because a Democrat is the president that Republicans have low confidence in the government. And one thing that Democrats have been trying to call Republicans out on is their spending cuts, because the National Institutes of Health director, Francis Collins, basically said that they've been working on a vaccine for over a decade, and if there had not been any spending cuts, they probably would have a vaccine by now.
All right. Well, Mike Riccardi, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Coming up, a response to Mike Huckabee. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Finally tonight, with midterms fast approaching, what has Mike Huckabee down the stretch advice to his fellow Republicans been? Well, he said, quote, grow a spine, show a modicum of knowledge about the way we govern ourselves. To that I thought, well, that's pretty good advice to candidates on both sides of the aisle. And then I had the misfortune of reading the quote in context. As it so happens, Mr. Huckabee was not concerning himself with the depressing lack of leadership and competent execution in what has been polled to be America's most unpopular branch of government. Rather, his primary concern was that the Supreme Court has predominantly ruled in favor of pro-gay marriage lawsuits. Now, this brings me to a quote I heard earlier this week from Vice President Joe Biden. The Vice President said, quote, now I'm going to be honest with you. This isn't your dad's Republican Party anymore. The Vice President's words perfectly summed up my growing frustration with America's current opposition party. In the 11th hour of campaigning, the time when most important issues need to be discussed, Mike Huckabee isn't talking about the global war on terror, he isn't talking about the growing gap in wealth and inequality, and he isn't even talking about our country's failing immigration system. He is talking about gay marriage. He is talking about issues that proud Republicans like Dwight D. Eisenhower and Ronald Reagan would be embarrassed to discuss. He believes if more Republicans stand together and fight social progress, they will be elected to higher office. Well, here's my advice for any young, inspiring Republicans. Don't listen to a man whose highest held office is in a cable news outlet's Fifth Avenue skyrise. That wraps up this week's edition of Talking Points. Thank you so much for joining us. Be sure to check out our Facebook page for more analysis on the biggest political issues of the day. We'll see you next week for an all-new edition of Everything Political.